So, I have the pleasure to introduce you to a writer that I worked with now. As you heard Kel say, she did the um, editing and the close story work with Tonya because that's something that we split the labour of during the process of creating these anthologies. Mr. Rowan Curtis is a gentleman that I worked with very closely in the previous anthology for his story Piano Wire, which takes on some pretty heavy topics in a young adult setting and is particularly focused on the conflict and subsequent refugee crisis in Syria. It tells a story of two teenagers separated by conflict and geographical distance. A young girl who begins the story in Aleppo, and a young man who is in England watching these things unfold on his television screen. So I'm going to give you a very short extract from that, and then we'll bring Rowan in for a lovely chat indeed. So, pardon me whilst I do all of the hosting, all of the tech, and reading things, and bringing people into Zoom at the same time. This is going to be fun. We're hoping this is going to work. So I shall read you this wonderful short extract from Piano Wire by Rowan Curtis from the Odd Voices anthology. Rubble cuts into my feet as I hide bent double within what was once our fireplace. I must stay awake, but at night the wailing of the helpless is monotonous. Does it come from men, infants, or wolves? No one knows. Not that it would make any difference. Sleep leads to being found. I've seen it. I haven't slept since the 18th. 2 days. My eyelids are heavy, my legs ache, my mind scattered, conjures a lucid dream of Miran dancing around the piano. But the moment I touch the keys, I fall into a familiar nightmare. It is an extremely chilling story, and one that I hope our author is immensely proud of. So we shall go across into the world of Zoom again. I do believe he's here. Hello, Rowan. How are you, my dear?
I'm very well, thank you. I've been moving house today, so I'm a little bit frazzled. But
oh gosh, we picked a wonderful day to catch you on camera then, didn't we?
yeah, it's a busy time. It's a busy time, and I'm feeling recovered now after half an hour of sitting here and drinking squash and rereading the story, reminding myself what I might read.
Yes, I just did that recently as well, because it's been a fair while since we worked together on Piano Wire.
Lots happened.
Yeah, there were obviously some really pivotal moments that have always stuck in my mind from that story. It's certainly one of my personal favourites from the previous anthology, and was a pleasure to work on with you. So yes, it's been a while since we've been in touch. So I wondered if you'd give us a brief sort of introduction to yourself, what you're about in day-to-day life, and what's going on with you and your writing career nowadays.
Sure. So I'm a mid-20s, currently PhD student, who probably spends more time writing than my academic supervisor would like. I've been writing short stories and novels and poetry since I was about 18 or so. And for me, it originated from this feeling of wanting to write about Southampton, which is the city I grew up in. And there wasn't any literature really about Southampton. You had a few mentions in Shakespeare and elsewhere, but very rarely would you find stories of people from Southampton. Or even characters moving through the place. And so I started writing a novel about Southampton and only just finished it this January.
Wow.
Well, I've been doing all sorts of writing endeavors, and I think I'm one of these people who waits for the fire to come about something, and most of my stories come out of a moment or a feeling or a reaction to something, and then I guess a feeling that writing is very fundamental to my way of processing the world. And so I kind of churn these stories out and then pass them to my trusted group of 2 or 3 readers and my family and my partner, and then they tell me whether it's, you know, worth throwing in the bin or worth passing on. And so, yeah, so I'll finish my PhD in the next 6 months or so, and I have a big choice to make as to which thing I try and focus on the most, because writing is really where my heart is, but I also spend a lot of time, obviously, you know, doing a different 9 to 5 like a lot of people. So yeah, so about my writing at the moment, as I said, I've just finished a novel, which is realistic fiction about Southampton, about the British class system and how the class system affects your ability to love and grieve and all these different things. And it's about people from Southampton, and it's about addiction and social mobility and all those other things that you can imagine. So I finished that in January, and I then took 4 months off, which wasn't planned, but felt like maybe I'd used up all the juice in my battery.
After a novel, yes, that's certainly to be expected.
I think so. And anyway, last week I started writing again, and I'm now back in the zone, and I'm working on a few short stories, and venturing into magical realism, and I'm also sketching out my next novel, which is hopefully a magical realist book.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to meet writers who have diverse approaches, who are multi-genred and have multi-styles, because that very much resonates with the way I like to write. It's interesting to hear you talk about writing in the moment and something that grips you at the time. So, with that in mind, can you tell us a little bit about what was the moment that made you write Piano Wire and the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so it's a very memorable one for me. Maybe the most strong emotional reaction I had to something. So I was working at Diamond Light Source at the time, particle accelerator, and I was in the lab working on an experiment, and it took about half an hour to do the experimental run. And so during the time I'm waiting for the thing to do its magic and make sure it's not on fire, I was reading through the news, and it was during the time when the Battle of Aleppo was happening in Syria, and I'd been keeping up with the Syrian war. It was something I'd become interested in, and the Western news wasn't great at reporting it, but was maybe better at reporting the Syrian war than it has been in what's been happening in Northeast Africa at the moment. What happens, you know, in other countries that aren't westernized.
Yes.
And I remember watching a news story which had interviews with 2 or 3 civilians on the ground talking about their situation. And it was incredibly emotional, incredibly stark. And I think I felt a rage that most of the people I spoke to during that day didn't even necessarily recognize something was happening in Syria, and also didn't necessarily recognize how Western powers had you know, influenced what's been happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, I see
30 years. So anyway, so it came out of that moment, and then I had this rage inside me about it, and didn't really know what to do with it. Didn't necessarily think about writing a story for a little while until I was at university and met, because I was too far removed from the situation. I was at university and met two refugees who were at the same university as me, who'd come from Aleppo, and from their input and talking to them about Syria, I thought, okay, maybe I could give this a go tentatively, because I try not to write too much about things I don't know about. It's probably a good start. And then yeah, Piano Wire came out of it, and I wanted to try and make a story which would be, or at least from my viewing point, I thought the one thing I could do is to try and make it accessible and potent for a Western reader. And so this is one of the real things in the book, is to try and create the instability and the not knowing of the refugee Rima, who's really the hero of the story, but also to connect it to the West by introducing a young Londoner, and then have this connection between an object in the story And so that was my starting point, and it really just flowed from there in a Cafe Nero in Guildford at the time, and in 3 sessions, wrote it in 3 sessions across a weekend.
Wonderful when something comes out on that kind of quick fire. You know
It's
you're
rare.
onto something, don't you?
Do you have that with your writing? Is that standard for you, or are you?
Yeah, it varies from idea to idea, but certainly with short stories, usually if I don't finish it in the first couple of goes, I'll never finish it.
Yeah,
It's
strike
like
while the iron's hot.
yeah, it's a very all or nothing approach. But I think when you get on a roll with something like that, it's kind of a euphoric feeling as a writer when you know you're into it and completely in the moment and in the emotion with these characters and the scenes are flowing. It's yes, I although I can imagine it must have been quite well, certainly difficult to put yourself into the mindset of particularly, people undergoing crisis in Syria. I would say, I think, as you perhaps rightly say, Liam's character, the young lad in London, would be more accessible and easier to relate to because we're all here watching the events unfold. So, can you talk a little bit more about the sort of the information that you got from your associates at university that you were able to talk to about their experiences, but also getting into the head of Rima and getting into the head of a teenage girl, because I feel like that can be such a hurdle for writers who are not of that age and gender, and you achieved it beautifully, in my opinion. So I wondered how you went about that.
Thank you. So, firstly, with the sources, if you will, it was a large listening exercise of listening to 2 people. One was female, one was male, and they were telling me about their lives and their childhoods and their stories. And I really didn't want to try and recreate either of their stories. I actually wanted to maybe not even stick to pure realism, but to create an atmosphere, because I knew that there was no way I'd get to the realism. And so the thing I really focused on was trying to allow the feeling of insecurity and also the feeling of immense motion, but almost motion which moves faster than you are able to process the situation. And so with the 2 chapters in London, the pace and the writing style is more rigid and slowed down. In the first chapters, it chops and flows, almost in a sense that I tried to let that feeling of like motion from underneath you that moves so fast that your feet can't catch up to pervade through the story. And so that's what I focused on. In terms of getting into another person's viewpoint that I don't have myself, it's something I think a lot about. I actually don't often write from a similar viewpoint from myself. So in my novel, I have various women whose perspective I write from, and various age groups. And my main character is a middle-aged man who loses his wife and children, and it's something I've never experienced. So I think to do it, I don't understand what it's like to be a woman, but I can listen well to women, and I think I'm a very sensitive person, and I think hopefully a good listener. And most of the strongest forces in my life are women. My mum, my partner, and so listening to them, being aware of what what they say in response to my writing, what can I learn from them, but also trying to come at it from the perspective of a human being in the situation, and then really imagining, okay, so what challenges might come about for a woman, or a young girl, or an older man, for instance, and really allowing that to not dictate, because that's not the point, but never to forget those things. And there is maybe one way to start is to actually see what not to do, and most men in history give good examples of how not to write. I just read Vanity Fair by Thackeray. There are some examples of how not to write about women, in the same way that Tolstoy gives us great examples of how not to write about peasants, because he makes them seem perfect and they're not individuals anymore because of that, for instance. And so, yeah, one good example is to read a lot of classics and work out how not to write from the perspective of someone from that situation. But I do think that there is value in writing from perspectives which are not our own, but it's something that takes a lot of energy and a lot of care, and also a lot of questions to people who may understand better, and then work on the story with them, listening to them. But it was a challenge, and I wasn't really sure how at first I got on with it. But I thought that the story held together better in the form that it was in, and I think Rima is fantastic, and she has the endurance that you can imagine a young girl having in that situation, and
very much so.
Yeah, and I feel like the story holds together well because of who she is, and that was how my brain fleshed it out, if you will. So I don't know if I answered all your questions there, but
I think you did, and I think you speak very well about it being a learning experience to write empathetically and to try for authenticity from voices that are not our own. Because of course, with Odd Voice Out Publishing, we have a lot of own voice writers who come in and celebrate their culture and their perspective, and indeed several that we'll be speaking to tonight. But there's also this wonderful allyship of listening to other people's experiences and learning through writing. And as you quite rightly say, I would always encourage everyone to be informed about what you write, but also to learn through writing and to experiment, whether it turns out well, in the case of Piano Wire, as you say, with feedback from influential people in your life to give you those ideas, and indeed in the sort of editing process that we work through for certain moments, you get different perspectives from everywhere. But yeah, I think it's a wonderful experience to do. Even if it doesn't turn out successfully, you will have learned something about people who aren't like you, and that's always valuable, for sure.
Yeah, there are many examples of the not so good ones as well.
Yes.
I think fiction is a really good chance for allies, as you said, to express themselves about other people's experiences. And a great example of this, which I was thinking about a lot just before the time that I read this story, was Sebastian Barry, who, I don't know if you've read Days Without End, won the Costa Prize. Sebastian Barry is an Irish man, I think in his 50s, who I saw speaking in person a few months before writing Piano Wire. And Days Without End is about two soldiers in the American Civil War who are in love. And Sebastian Barry is heterosexual and married with children, as far as I know. But his son came out that year, and Days Without End was his expression of appreciation and respect for his son, and his son Toby gets the acknowledgement at the beginning of the book. And so I was really thinking about this, and I do think that as you said, there's value in people writing from perspectives that aren't their own, and that fiction is the perfect place for that, because it's an extension of what fiction is, at its core, which is being empathetic and imagining. The reading process itself and the writing process is imagining ourselves in different shoes than our own. And so if done well and faithfully, I think it's perfect.
Absolutely, yeah. I think can be a very celebratory, explorative journey to be able to do that, as you say, quite rightly, as a writer, but also as a reader. I would certainly hope that anyone who picks up these anthologies and picks up the wonderful stories is able to leave themselves for a moment and understand the perspective of another, whether they're near or far, similar or different. It's always a good exercise to do. So to sort of round off, I wanted to ask you about something that I wondered when I was editing the work, in terms of its theming, where you have this beautiful connection to music that comes from both Rima and Liam. during the story, and indeed the title of the story, Piano Wire, hints to that, although there are different layers to the title which readers will discover when they read the story for themselves, and I very much recommend that they do. Um, where did that where did that come from, that idea to connect these two very disparate, different protagonists in the world of music?
That's a very good question. I don't remember the moment or the decision and why I took it. Um, I I have a feeling I was from the outset. I knew I wanted something to connect our characters. Music is incredibly important in my life. I'm a musician and spend a lot of time on music, and it's something that, as I've passed through my own life and met people who really are very different to me, um, we're not really, but on the surface, we seem very different. Um, Music is something I often come back to in terms of trying to connect with someone from a totally different background to my own, and and that's a habit I think I've always had in my life, and I like a very eclectic range of music styles, and so can often find common ground with people,
Yeah.
even imagine you didn't have that common ground. So music seemed a natural one to do, um, and obviously in the modern day, music passes around the world so freely, and so I actually think that the final decision came when, without saying anything to spoil what happens at the end of the story, the last few lines, uncharacteristically to how I usually write, I wrote quite early on.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
I knew this twist in the tale, if you will, from the beginning, and it seemed to me that to use music as the theme was both a natural and habit, but also it seemed like the right decision in terms of the structure and the feel of the story. And yeah, the music thing runs all the way through, and in chapter 4, if there's a chance to do some reading, which was the thing I was thinking about reading, um, you hear music coming even in the times of silence or difficulty, or where there are no voices or whatever. And so I suppose when writing a story which is very dark or in a seemingly inhumane environment, trying to find humanity in those situations is what we look for in literature.
Mm.
It's what gives us a story beauty often, and music from silence is akin to that, and so it's something universal, and it also worked well with the fabric of the story, even in the first scene where Rima is playing piano with her brother. So it really wove through the whole story, and I think that was a decision quite early on, but I'm not exactly sure how it came about, but it seemed to work, so that's
But
good.
as you say, as you're sort of revealing to me now as we're talking about it, because music plays such a big part in your life,
Mm.
it's almost a natural inclusion in something where you're talking about connecting with people and the universality of connection across distance and things. You know, we all, I think most of us find something in music. It's yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to know that there's such a big part of you in the story without having that sort of author insertion into it. You know, there's certainly a personality and an attitude within that, and this beautiful sense of universality that it gives to it with that theming. And I think it really, it's one of the levels on which it works so well, that sort of spoke to my soul when I was reading it, when I was judging them in the first place. So thank you for that. You satisfied my curiosity, and I'm sure whetted the appetites of many others who will be
Oh, good, thank you.
looking
I think
forward to
there,
reading it. Um,
yeah,
yeah, so I have one final question for you before I let you go. This may be maybe a tad philosophical, but I think we've certainly touched on some of the themes that it might work for you. What do you hope that readers, whoever they are, wherever they come from, would take away when they engage with Piano Wire as a story?
it's getting away from, as a Western reader or a person detached from a situation are very apparent at the moment in the pandemic. Our ability to see a story and to see numbers and to hear facts or propaganda or whatever, and to get into the habit of forgetting the individuals on the other end of things. And I think this is why fiction is such a powerful thing. We can read a writer's experiences, and it's an emotional exposure to that situation. And we can read about individuals. Often in life, in the individual details, the power comes. So I think if anything, I would like a person to finish reading the story and with lofty aspirations, I'd say that I'd like them next time they read stories on the news about people who may seem very far away from them, to see them as individuals and to have empathy for them. And in this country and in others, there is a tendency to see refugees. I mean, not everyone, but some people see refugees and can be very inhumane towards their
Yes, unfortunately true.
And we've seen that in the States, we've seen that in the UK, we've seen that all across the world forever. And so if we can break down this habit or this process and allow us to connect better and to recognize that actually we have a lot more in common with someone from X, Y, or Z who is in this desperate situation, and that actually maybe, wouldn't be so crazy for this to happen to us at some point in our lives. Wherever you live or whatever you do. We've all had our worlds turned upside down. The world's gone mad, as you're saying.
Yes, especially now, yeah.
And everyone in their life can go through periods where they are struggling to different degrees. And so, yeah, it's just that ability to empathize with an individual who you're reading about, instead of seeing statistics on a page, I think.
I think that's an absolutely beautiful point to end on. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I'm sure that many of the writers and readers who are listening to this and indeed may see this back when it's all packaged up and put on YouTube later on, that will certainly agree. It's a beautiful sentiment, and it's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you, Rowan.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us.